I do think Christians should support classical education. I think it's the closest that we'll get to truly influencing the culture. And I mean, I think that what we need a lot more classical academies. I mean, Orange County Classical Academy is just one, but we need a lot more of them. And I think especially in areas that are that some of the lower income areas where they're black and brown children.
Yeah.
I think it's a real opportunity, because the thing is they're sort of trapped. And so one thing we wanted to accomplish with OCCA, which is why we placed it in, specifically where we did in El Modena, was because it was a primarily minority area, and it would give an opportunity for those kids to have a great education. Whereas the school that's next to us, which is Esplanade Elementary, it is a failing school. Now, within 3 years, we had become a California distinguished school. 3 years in existence.
Hi, everyone. This is Anthony Costello with the Kirkwood Center podcast for Theology and Ethics. In this last episode of the Kirkwood Center podcast, I interviewed Walter Meyer, who is a member of the Orange County Classical Academy here in Orange County, California. And we talked about the need to recapture classical education in our country, and also how Christians can get engaged in supporting the project of classical education. Remember, if you enjoyed this episode of the Kirkwood Center podcast, click the subscribe and the like buttons, and we look forward to seeing and hearing from you in the comments section below. Thank you so much, and enjoy the interview. Okay, everyone. My name is Anthony Costello, and this is the Kirkwood Center podcast for Theology and Ethics. Today, I'm joined by a colleague and friend, Walter Meyer, who is an expert, I'd say, in what is classical education, or push for classical education, or recapturing classical education in our culture. A very important topic for us today. As you know, we've talked about this before in other podcasts. There's a lot of good theorizing. There's a lot of good resources for the church in apologetics, in academic and theology, philosophy of religion. But Walter, one of the things I want to talk to you about today is Christian education. I mean, at some point we have to get into the process of how to take all of our theoretical knowledge, all of the work that's being done in the academy, and really understanding how to apply it in a way that actually affects the culture over time. And that's why I wanted to have you on today, because I know you've been involved in some classical academies here in the Southern California area. And this is a topic that really has exercised your thinking and your engagement over the last several years. So welcome to the podcast, first of all, I guess I should say.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. And so, Walter, with regards to Christian, before we get into just trying to get a grasp on what is classical education, how Christians can approach it, use it, and how we can support specific movements in the classical education world, just give us some background of yourself, a little bit of your educational background, and how you sort of got involved in this particular topic and this particular issue.
Sure, Tony. Well, I got my master's degree in philosophy of religion and ethics back in 2013 at Talbot School of Theology on the Biola campus. And I've always been interested in education. My parents have been. My mom was an administrator for decades, and I have a sister that's involved in it. And so it was just something that was always sort of brewing in the background for me. But as I became an instructor at at Talbot. I'm in the Master of Arts in Science and Religion program. I teach there with George Hunter and Dr. John Bloom, in the Master of Arts in Science.
We know and love very much. Yes.
Yes, we know and love very much. So love teaching there. And I have a good friend, Jeff Barkey, and another friend, Mark Bucher, who started the Orange County Classical Academy. And they asked me if I would like to be involved, and I was like, oh, absolutely. And Orange County Classical Academy, I'm on the board of Orange County Classical Academy now, and OCCA for short, is a tuition-free public classical charter school. I believe it is the only it's not the only classical charter school, but in Orange County, but there aren't many. Then there are many barriers to it. But with respect to your question about Christians and looking at classical education, there are classical Christian charter schools throughout the country.
Mhm.
But if you want to change the culture, you're not going to get people who are not Christians, in classical Christian schools, because I'm presuming that there's a requirement there. But for classical education, there is no specific requirement or particular beliefs. You can be of any, secular beliefs or religious beliefs. It's not important. What's important is this system of pedagogy is really about the Aristotelian virtues. And the great thing about the Aristotelian virtues is that much of Aristotelian virtues, when you think about it from the Christian perspective, it's a subset of of the Christian values, because you're talking about things really about instilling virtues in the children, in children. That's sort of the first thing. It's instilling virtue, respect. And then it's the matter of sort of making them taking those minds, those young minds, and forming them, right, to become intelligent, literate, curious, who can read, write, calculate, understand, solve problems, and just have a wide range of interests. And that's really what a liberal arts education, is about. And so it's probably a classical education is probably the closest thing you can get, to a Christian education without being explicitly Christian. So a lot of those Christian values that we as Christians believe in, you will see a lot of that inculcated in a classical education. But let me just talk real quick about OCCA. Well, OCCA is a Hillsdale classical charter school. So Hillsdale several years ago started the Hillsdale College in Hillsdale, Michigan, started the Barney Charter School Initiative, BCSI. They don't use the term as much anymore, but basically they have about 20 or so charter schools, classical schools, throughout the U.S., and we are affiliated with them. So not only do we use the curriculum, we actually are affiliated with them. So board members go for training at Hillsdale, the teachers and administrators go for training at Hillsdale. So it's a very comprehensive and rigorous program, because classical education is not easy to teach. It's you really have to understand what it is about, and teachers have to learn how to teach. It's a different way of teaching. And so that's why there's so much education from Hillsdale in terms of making sure that we're doing it the right way, and that the children get the right level of education, and that it is taught properly, because it's not easy.
Yeah, well, okay, that's good. I want to unpack several of the ideas that you brought up there. One is, well, let's go ahead and start with this concrete instantiation of classical education that is the Orange County Classical Academy here in Orange County. I mean, I should say I'm actually sitting in Chicago right now visiting my family on vacation, but I'll be back in California next week. And that's certainly a very strategic area. I mean, I was telling my kids recently, like, we got LA County and Orange County together. You are living in the most densely populated part of the entire country. With those two counties put together. Those two counties, the total population of those two counties is bigger than the population of 30 individual states.
Wow, I didn't realize that.
Yeah, I looked on one of those maps that gives you these interesting little demographics. So there are 30 states that have less population, not together, but less population on their own than just LA County, Orange County put together. So this is an important, I mean, if you're going to start well, and not that this is the only movement of classical education, but if you want to really do something that's going to grow roots and have some spread and some impact, this is a great area to do that. It's interesting though that, you say, I grew up Catholic, right? In Southside Chicago, all different kinds of immigrant Catholics, Polish Catholics, Irish Catholics, Italian Catholics, so on and so forth. And it was the case that the Southside Chicago was dominated by Catholic parishes, all of which had schools. And it used to be the case, maybe certainly before I grew up, and then still when I was a kid, I'm 47, that non-Christians were more than happy to send their kids to Catholic schools if they could afford them, because there was still a semblance of a classical education. You were going to get Latin, and and just, I would say, not just the teaching, but also the sense of there's a structured kind of authority and discipline in the classroom that you weren't getting in the public schools.
And also a teaching of values as well.
And of course the values. Now, and the people, right, exactly. The values and the Catholic moral tradition. And not everybody in those schools, certainly not my school, was Catholic, maybe not even really religious at all, but the parents felt, that this was a more serious education and a more overall and comprehensive. So, but that's been lost. I mean, this is, I think, in part what we would be trying to gain, and where people might be reluctant to send their kids right now to a Christian classical academy. The idea of a non-Christian but still classical academy, I think, is sort of that middle ground, that mediating place there where a lot of people might be very interested in getting involved.
Yeah, Tony, it is. And what's interesting is that what we've heard from some parents. Now, we're located in the El Modena part of Orange, of the city of Orange. We are a county classical school. Our charter it originally was Orange Unified, but just had a lot of issues with it. So now we're county classical school. And interesting thing was some of the parents in the neighborhood, and so we give priority to those it's pretty much 80% Hispanic, it's Hispanic area, mostly Hispanic area. I'm not sure what percentage, but it's very high Hispanic area, that El Modena area, and of course those kids get first priority. I think one of the issues is and we have not had any problems with attendance. In fact, we have almost 1,000, I think, somewhere between 900 and 1,000 kids on the waiting list now. So it's pretty hard to get into lottery. You can't discriminate. There's a lottery. We can give, again, it's part of our charter. We can give preference to the kids in the neighborhood. And that's why you set up that's why you want to set up charter schools in these areas where you have underprivileged kids, because you want to give them an opportunity they would not otherwise have to get a quality education. But, some of the parents in the area feel we're a Christian school. I mean, even though we say we're not a Christian school, they said, "Oh, you are a Christian school," and we're not a Christian school. Yes, there are many Christians, who are running the school, but the thing is, there's nothing explicitly Christian about the school. So that is one sort of barrier, because I think there are people out there who are, I would say, our opponents, the people in the teachers unions and in various school districts that will make that charge because they don't want us to succeed. So they will say, "Oh, well, they're a Christian school." And it's like, no, we're not a Christian school. We're a classical education school, and we're very strict about providing an explicitly classical education.
All right, that's okay. So let's focus in on opposition, okay? Because it seems to me, with a classical education model, you could get opposition from two groups that themselves are in opposition, right? So I know you've done a little bit of work on critical theory.
Mhm.
And we both have a little bit, studied that academically. And I think that's relevant here. And we'll talk about that in a second, because
Mhm.
one opponent, how to put it, would be sort of like the progressive, critical, to use the term that James Lindsay, I think, critical social justice was what
Yes.
he finally landed on as sort of a,
Mhm.
a, a reasonable term to describe what the kind of neo-Marxism that we're seeing right now. So that sort of critical social justice, progressive, which it's been around for a while. It's nothing new, but that really sort of is almost hegemonic now, right,
Mhm.
in education. So you say one opponent that we could kind of, there's one opponent there to classical education. But I could also see Christians, some Christians at least, or some Christian denominations, maybe saying, well, this sounds like pagan philosophy or something, that we don't want to adulterate a clear biblical Christian teaching or something like this. So you know maybe talk about that. What kind of
Yeah, sure.
resistance do you see? You mentioned the first already. Maybe you're not seeing much of the latter, but I could kind of see maybe opposition from two sides here.
I mean, I can see that, but let's go to Romans. Let's go to Romans 1. When Paul talks about the natural law. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, really, a classical education is based on the natural law. In other words, what we try to teach kids are teach the children is, what are the things that you just simply know that are right? When you talk about the virtues, there are certain things that are common to all. They're common to all of us. We know right from wrong. And so what we want the children to do is, when they're thinking through things, instead of sort of going to their base nature, which we all have a human nature. And I'd say Aristotle was excellent in terms of helping us understand humans have a particular nature, an essential nature. Now, as Christians, we would say, well, that essential nature is that we are sinful. And so he doesn't go that far because he's a pagan, but we understand it as that human nature is that we're sinful. So when you talk to children, when you try to help children to understand that, don't to go against the baser nature of humans, to go against the baser nature of humans is
Mm-hmm.
to be thoughtful, to think about right from wrong, to think about things good from bad, and then to be educated in a way that you can actually rigorously think through those things through what classical educations rest on, this concept of sort of the trivium: grammar, logic, rhetoric. They're not necessarily subjects themselves, even though you can study them as subjects, but they're the structure of every subject and discipline. So when you are excellent in grammar, you're excellent in logic, you know how to think, and rhetoric, how to argue points back and forth, and be able to argue both sides of any particular argument. That's how you get a more thoughtful student. And that's when you were talking about earlier, as far as how do we change the culture. We don't have students coming through in the public education system now with that type of thinking, because, to your point, progressive education really is now the mode of public schools throughout the country. It's the teaching colleges are teaching progressive education. It really is about social justice, about all of these different identities that they make up. And the idea is, what you want, it's the primary goal is not to produce a well-rounded student with a liberal arts and sciences education. The goal is basically to make them into the next
A political operative, basically. Yeah.
political activist. I
Yeah.
mean, it I know some people look, oh, that sounds like conspiracy theory. It's not conspiracy theory, because you can read the book by Isaac Gottsman, The Critical Turn. The
Mhm.
critical turn has been going on pretty much for the past 50 years or so. And if you want to extrapolate it back to progressivism, which started in the early 1900s with
John Dewey.
Woodrow Wilson, yeah,
Yeah.
Dewey, the Princeton people,
Right.
who were associated with Princeton. Their idea was they wanted to get away from these were people who were who were leery of the Constitution. They did not like the concept of individual rights. They believed in the power of the administrative state. And this is, I know it's probably getting a little wonky, but really it's based on the Hegelian dialectic.
No,
right?
I think we have to keep bringing,
Yeah.
The last interview I did was on Messianic Judaism, so that didn't pop up there. But in the other interviews I've done, and so many, that are just on culture in general or different aspects of our institutions, it's hard to not bring up Hegel and then how Marx conceives of Hegel, the whole flipping of Hegel on his head, because it is kind of the worldview in which we are swimming, and have to sort of, if there needs to be a great awakening, it has to be sort of waking out of this idea of history's progressing. Here's the substructure that we know is driving all of the superstructural forces, and we just need the elite group of people who can, from the top down, plan everything through big government. It just is kind of that way. And the institution that was compromised first, and I'd like to go into, is the educational,
academy.
The academy. And I'm reminded, I'm going to give a couple examples here. I was reading a old book on church history, written in the 1930s by an old by some Catholic educator, and he makes this point, which is fairly well known. But right after Constantine, Constantine's son was still a Christian of some sort. But there was a short reign of an emperor by the name of Julian, who often is called in the history books Julian the Apostate, who really made a concerted effort to bring the Roman Empire back to its pagan and polytheistic roots. The very first thing he did was shut down the Christian schools.
There you go.
That the first thing you had to do was educate a generation, re-educate a generation. And then you think later of Dewey, and then Gramsci, and the march through the institutions. I know that wasn't actually Gramsci's, but whoever said that around that time. I think it was.
It was in a book that was written sometime in the 1960s. I recall. I forget the name, but yes, it was in a book.
I think it was
the March of the
Brazilian Marxist or something. And then I pulled up the old speech, Ronald Reagan's speech about the evil empire, where he quotes, it's in 83, quotes C.S. Lewis's line from Screwtape Letters about, the greatest evils are not done by the jackboots, by the prison guard, they're done by the clean shaven, quiet men who sit in their offices and plan things out in advance. And then you see ultimately 30 or 40 years down the line, the final results in the streets, right?
Yeah, you see this out of it. This is all. It's really kind of interesting because this all seems to come out of. It all has its roots in German idealism, right?
Yeah, I know.
And so if you look at what's happened in the academy over the past 50 years, like pretty much from the 1950s and 1960s, when the Germans came over from the Frankfurt School,
right, and
started infecting Columbia and all the other Ivy League schools, and eventually getting to pretty much their pedagogy to all of the academy. That's where the Marxists went in the 60s. They realized, look, and this was the difference. Marx was really about economics, right?
The mechanism
was really about culture, right? This was about a cultural revolution as opposed to an economic revolution, if you will. So this cultural revolution was, hey, look, what we can do is if we can get into the education and into academia, and we can spread our message, this way we can get the next generation. So you get the teachers first, you spread this this neo-Marxist thought throughout the teachers, and what happened was in the 80s, there was Paulo Freire's book.
Paulo Freire, that was
the Brazilian Paulo Freire. But they started to teach. He was a Pedagogy of the Oppressed was the book that he wrote, and so he he was basically teaching illiterate Brazilian, farmers, laborers how to, well, he taught them how to read because he wanted them to become revolutionaries. And so the academies adopted his approach to education, and his approach was, what he felt was that basically schools became, over time, became more child-centered instead of being more centered on language and knowledge centered. So that's what progressive education is about. And what he did not like was what he called the banking model. The banking model of education is you, the teacher, are pouring this information into the student. Well, he didn't like that, because the thing is, a teacher is pouring information and knowledge, and what he felt is that the student and the teacher should be on equal par, right? And that they're both learning from one another, and that it's really about these identities and making sure that the student is teaching the teacher as well. That's not the classical model of teaching. And so what you're doing is, in this context, you're teaching children to see the world in terms of oppressors and the oppressed, to see the world in terms of oppressed identities in this, what they called heteronormative, hegemonic, heteropatriarchal society.
Right.
And the idea is that if you get this inculcated in this sort of, I won't say inculcated, but if you sort of, the kids are growing up in this sort of milieu in terms of, from an education, that's how you get that next generation. And now there's been 2 generations of kids who have been really taught through that Freirean model of teaching, where it's all about power dynamics and oppression. And that's really not an education, because you're taking away time where the kids could actually be learning and learning, and you're taking away from their academic achievement. And that's why we're seeing so many children that are failing in the public schools, particularly Black and brown children who are trapped in the public school system because they don't have alternatives.
Well, and I'm reminded that one of the key figures in, maybe not that he was so interested in overturning the academic institutions, although he certainly his work certainly lead that way, but was Herbert Marcuse. And one of Marcuse's one of his most brilliant disciples was not Angela Davis, a Black woman who had tremendous influence on other women as well, and other Black women, and that's one way where I think that was one route through which this ideology, this Marxist ideology that was brought over by these crusty old white German men, found its way into, the minority social groups in America, and they latched onto that. And then we get to Crenshaw and the critical legal scholars in the 80s, and Bell and others. And one should just point out that it's a Marxist framework that they're using to interpret these things. It's not a classical education model.
Yeah, no, it's a neo-Marxist it's a neo-Marxist framework. Neo-Marxist in the sense that it's a cultural Marxism, and the very idea is to change the culture and to overturn this hegemonic system of oppression and capitalism.
And of course, they think they're doing they
think they're doing wonderful things because they believe in collectivism, right?
Yeah,
they believe in this. They believe that there's this sort of perfect utopian world that if you had this administrative running everything, and the interesting thing about it, Tony, is that the idea is they think that you need this administrative state, this powerful administrative state, and that eventually, once everyone is equal, it will fade away.
Right. I mean, this was
ever seen an administrative state give up its power?
Right. I mean, and it struck me about 2 years ago as I was reading various books that, and I'm sure other people have pointed this out. Just the way I pointed out is that seems to be the fundamental problem in this whole Marxist dynamic is the moral component for the Marxist is in the relationship between peoples.
Yes. Yeah.
Not in the persons occupying the positions themselves. the relatio between two people is what has to go away. It has to be totally even.
Yes.
The moral component is not in the heart or the will of the people. So it is kind of it's a sort of Rousseauian type idea as well.
Yes.
That
Absolutely.
people
Absolutely.
are the individual human heart is generally good, and it's
Yes.
the social structures that corrupt the person. And so that is, I think, probably the fun. I mean, aside from the rejection of God as creator of man and there being a human nature.
Well, because you can't have God, right? If it's the government, it's the administrator that gives you your rights, you can't have a God giving you your rights, and that's the way. That's why they want to get rid of natural rights. They don't believe in natural rights, and
Yes.
what they believe is that the capitalist, hegemonic, heteronormative, heteropatriarchal system. What they think that does is when, say, Tony, you have kids. You raise your kids up, you send them to school, you help them through their schooling, you send them to college, and then they go off and get a job. Well, the way the neo-Marxists say, that's a bad thing because you are reproducing the hegemonic capitalist system, and
Paradigm.
that's what they don't
Paradigm.
like.
Yeah.
This reproduction, right? We
Right.
just keep reproducing, and they just don't like that reproduction. They want to stop that reproduction of that
Of course,
capitalist hegemonic society.
they can never really say in any great detail what the perfected democracy is going to look like, but of course they'll keep talking about it and doing everything they can to deconstruct or destroy
Right.
what has come before. And of course, it's hard, I think, on this view to talk about what progress actually is. What are you progressing to? Because there's not really a standard, because nothing can ever be fixed. You can never say there's really a fixed standard that we are trying. There's no
Well, yeah, there is none. In fact, Freire would say it's perpetual revolution. If
perpetual
you're not
revolution.
there's not perpetual revolution. But
So
I mean, how do you have perpetual revolution? Every time. In other words, once you get to something that's normative,
yeah,
that's when they say, well, that's not good because it's
yeah.
become normative.
And that's in every single one of the Frankfurt School, especially pronounced in Adorno as well. That once you have something that's sort of, within the term they'll use, reified,
Mm-hmm.
that then has to be deconstructed itself, because it'll take on this become this grotesque monster of
Right.
power.
So it'll be the thesis, then there'll be an
Right.
antithesis, and then the synthesis, the Hegelian
And then
synthesis.
we're
So
back to Hegel.
it'll continue to evolve.
Yeah. So and look, I think it's important to go off on this little theoretical tangent, because what we want to impress for the audience is, I mean, there's always been this kind of dual attack. It's certainly against the Judeo-Christian tradition, but it's also against what we would just call the Western canon of literature, which is, the Greek and the Roman tradition. That, yes, it's pagan, but, it is antithetical, especially Plato, but also, Peter Kreeft, I think, is right when he says Aristotle's still a Platonist. He's just placing things in different locations
In different ways.
than Plato was. And so, as you've mentioned Aristotle several times here, the double attack that really ramps up in the United States in the beginning of the 20th century, and mainly in the domain of education, is, yes, it's against the Bible, it's against revelation knowledge, but it's also against this view of general revelation.
Yes, of general revelation.
And
Yes,
natural theology, or natural philosophy, that goes back to the Greeks. And of course, that's going to be a much closer view of things, especially given that Augustine synthesizes biblical revelation with Neoplatonism, and Aquinas's synthesis in the Middle Ages with of course, Aristotle. So that's good. So we've talked about, I think, that's certainly I think that's the big fight, right? I mean, that's at least one of the major civilizational fights that's going on right now. And then this is why it's so important to get to the real concrete work of setting up and supporting these kinds of schools.
Yeah, Tony, I think I do think Christians should support classical education. I think it's the closest that we'll get to truly influencing the culture. And I think that what we need is we need a lot more classical academies. I mean, Orange County Classical Academy is just one, but we need a lot more of them. And I think especially in areas that are that some of the lower income areas where they're black and brown children.
Yeah.
I think it's a real opportunity, because the thing is they're sort of trapped. And so one thing we wanted to accomplish with OCCA, which is why we placed it in, specifically where we did in El Modena, was because it was a primarily minority area, and it would give an opportunity for those kids to have a great education. Whereas the school that's next to us, which is Esplanade Elementary, it is a failing school. Now, within 3 years, we had become a California distinguished school. 3 years in
Yeah.
existence.
Okay.
Esplanade, the elementary school next to us, is a failing school, and what we have offered is to basically, hey, they have a field, they have a gym, they have a field, they have modulars. They won't let us using their stuff, and we're saying, hey, we would love to just take over the school, and we'll take all of your students who are interested. We'll take them all, okay, and we'll train them up, and we'll give them a classical education. But the district is definitely against it, even though the school is the attendance is being lowered. And some people will say, well, hey, with the classical education, you're stealing from the schools and making it worse for those people who are in the public schools. But what I'm advocating for is, I think that all the public schools should move to a classical model.
Yeah.
And I think if they were to move to the classical model, there are a number of things, obviously, that go along with the classical model, but it is a way, I think, of providing children with a high quality education. And the thing is, it's liberal arts and sciences. You're reading the great books. 3 years of Latin at Orange County Classical Academy. So you really are teaching the children, how to think and just how to be thoughtful human beings. And I think that's the most important thing when you think about these kids, is where they're going to be a generation from now, where they're going to be 20 years, 30 years from now. They're going to be our leaders 20, 30 years from now. Don't you want leaders who are well-rounded, who are thoughtful? They're not the type of people who are going to go out there and do things that are, in other words, let me just put it this way. Children with a classical education, what I think is most important about it is the way that you're training children. These are children that are going to grow up to evaluate people based on the content of the character and not the color of their skin. They're not gonna judge people based on whatever identities they
Whatever social features they might,
or social features or external features.
intersectionally
Exactly, intersection and all those things. And
Yeah.
the thing is, the public schools, public school systems, I mean, the progressive education, they're all about all these identities and making sure that you snap to these identities. But I mean, it just comes a point where it's so distracting. You're so busy talking about identities, and these new identities keep getting created. We're not talking about what is common to all people.
Yeah.
The natural law, the natural law, what is right and wrong, what is a common humanity that we have.
I mean,
And
the
that's what
diversity,
classical teaching.
Yeah, the diversity that is promoted to like the extreme, right, in our culture today is very shallow.
Yeah, it's shallow, and it separates, it divides. Yeah,
it's based on either just totally contingent properties of the person, like their skin color or something like this.
Exactly.
Or it's grounded in some kind of, just, and there's aberrant behavior. It's just like this person behaves oddly or differently, right? So let's create an identity around that. And that's mainly in the arena of the sexual arena, which would be a podcast for another time. But we're just carving people up by these very superficial features. Now, and that is in part because of the bigger metaphysical, the bigger rejection at the theoretical level of anything like a human nature in which we all participate and share. but again, that's part of why we need to re-educate the culture, right?
Yeah, and I mean, and I mean, people think of this progressive education, they think of it as secular. It's not secular. There's definitely religious motivation, and I mean, if you ask me, it's Gnostic. There's a lot of Gnosticism,
Yeah,
lot of Gnosticism in this, especially when you get to sort of the critical theory around around gender. I mean, it's Gnostic to the
I
core.
tell you, yeah, you read some queer theory, it's deeply almost mystical,
Yes,
right?
you
But
have to
that's
have the
why
know the
you need
knowledge.
the plus at the end of the LGBT, because there could always be some new feature or aspect of the mystery of sexuality and sexual that we discover or that
Yeah.
we happen upon, and then so. And there was even an article, I have to find it. Well, it's actually in a book that I have called Christianity and Critical Theory, which was mainly about in literature, but where the person was talking about conversion stories, right? And comparing coming out stories to religious conversion stories. And there's some interesting similarities there. And again, and it goes back to Romans 1 and what we know is true from Christianity, that at the end of the day, everybody is seeking God.
Yes.
And it's just, where are they immanentizing? Where are they confusing creator and creation?
Yeah.
And it shouldn't surprise us as Christians that sexuality would be one of the first things you'd try to sort of deify.
Yeah, from the neo-Marxist perspective, it's just one vector of attack. Your vector of attack will be sex,
Yeah.
gender, race, then there's queer, then there's fat. So
Right.
these really are vectors of attack.
Yeah. And ultimately, I think we got to point out there's no way that this actually turns into a unity, right?
Oh no,
I
no,
mean,
there's no unity in
it's a
this.
logical contradiction to say we can continuously divide something into smaller and smaller parts and then somehow get, and that is the mechanism to which we'll get some kind of unification.
Yeah, I like what President Biola Barry Corey said. There's really there's unity and diversity, or diversity and unity. In other words, when we're united, that natural diversity will come out. But when you try to do things in other words, you have to have something that's unifying. And human
First.
nature is what
Yeah.
unifies us.
Yeah.
Versus saying we're just a bunch of diverse types of things. But diversity does come out of a unity. But you need to have, to your point, you need to have that sense of unity, that sense of human nature. Romans 1, natural theology, the natural law, and the fact that you have to have something that's grounding you in natural law. And it's God that grounds us in the natural law. So you ultimately have to have something that you ultimately have to have a grounding. And with this progressive education, progressive ideology, you don't really have any grounding, because everything is pretty much subjective and continually evolving.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, look, it's obvious that we're seeing the end results of that when we look at things like rising suicide rates amongst young people. Now there are other factors in this, like social media, the technology that we have that we're not mature enough to use. But again, back to the thing though, I mean, why are we not mature enough to use the technology we have? But yeah, that's good. So let me ask this question then. So I think we talked a lot about the ideological opponents or opposition to classical theory of education. You talked about the OCCA and what it's doing, but what are some other than maybe just the theoretical, the worldview issues? What are some other maybe challenges or roadblocks to classical education? Just maybe structural things, institutional things that need to be changed or be overturned, that you're seeing, and then maybe how can people who get involved and get engaged and sort of carry this movement along a little bit?
Well, I mean, the road. I mean, primarily the roadblocks. The roadblocks that we see are there's a lot of misinformation about charter schools, and to begin with, and I mean, whether it's classical or not, there's just a lot of misinformation about them in terms of what are they trying to accomplish, and they feel that they hurt the students who are in the because we're taking away from the public school system. That means there's less money to go to those children. But interestingly, California over the past couple of years is actually where schools lost money, they'd actually fund the money, give them their full amount. I don't think that's good. I think that's going to end in the next couple of years, but I know they were doing that during COVID. But anyway, the broader issue there is that people feel that we're funneling away. The thing with classical education is the point is to demonstrate there is a better way of teaching. And if there's a better way of teaching, why don't the public schools actually adopt a better way of teaching? And so you can see where that's philosophical. And the teachers unions are the student. Okay, when you think about, you have a business, you have your customers, right? You take care of your customers, and you can have a great business, but you have to have a great business. You need to take care of your customers. Well, if you ask yourself in public schools, who is the customer? The customer is the teacher. The customer is not the student or the parents. And so when you're unsure about who your customers are, then you're going to take care of the teachers and not really think about what is best for the students. And so that's why there's so much pushback from the unions. And of course, the unions have a lot of money. And the unions give a lot of money to those people in Sacramento who continue to pass laws that are detrimental to or that kneecap charter schools. So those are really the biggest barriers. It's the teachers unions and the legislature that gives us less money and then tries to do things to hurt us as well. And the districts, they don't like the charter schools as well. So there's a lot of misinformation, as well as legislation that's against classical, pretty much any charter schools, and especially classical schools, because classical schools are teaching something different from progressive.
No, it's part of it. I mean, is part of it maybe too, and I don't want to, this would be hard to know and certainly hard to quantify in any way, but like, because you mentioned earlier, hey, this is a more rigorous way of educating. So is there a sense too, maybe where the public school teachers feel like, well, even if we thought this is a good model, we can't teach it. We're just not really qualified. And it kind of makes us feel a little like, I don't know, like, how would we even do this? How would we become classical educators if, I mean, I don't know if you get what I'm saying, but like,
well, there
I don't
is.
want to call it jealous. I don't want to call it like a jealousy thing. That maybe is too strong, but where it's like, you're asking, in a sense, you're asking educators to really also step up their game.
Oh, absolutely. And I tell you, they're the teachers who come from the public schools at OCCA. They will admit, and that's why they go to the training. That's why we have the training. That's why there's a curriculum. I mean, there's something called Singapore math, which is the best math in the world. It is very difficult to teach Singapore math.
Yeah.
It takes like 2 to 3 years for a teacher to master teaching Singapore math. But it's an excellent form of teaching math. And it is tough on the teachers, but the thing is, they're committed to it. So I think teachers, they're smart. I mean, they have a master's degree or PhD, they can figure it out. But one thing is in public education, the problem is in public schools, and I'll speak of California and specifically, do you realize that teachers can get tenure in 2 years in California? Tenure, 2 years. So after 2 years, you're guaranteed a job.
Well, you just got to work hard for 24 months.
24 months, and you get your tenure. Other states, it's 3 years to get tenure. Another thing is that in a classical school or charter school, it's going to be pay for performance. It'll be merit-based pay, and so it's based on academic achievement. And so teachers that don't deliver are not going to stay very long at a classical school. You have to deliver academic achievement because it's very, you were saying earlier.
So it's going to take some virtue. It's going to take some virtue to pursue this route of classical education to be a classical educator,
Yeah.
so there's it's challenge. There are challenges that need to be met and some need to be stepped up to.
Yeah, and another thing at a classical school is kids will wear uniforms.
Yeah.
You cannot have your smartwatch on during school. You can have your
Please.
smartwatch in your backpack,
Yeah.
but you can't have your smartwatch, your smartphone, or any other devices during the school hours, because those things are distracting. And also, it's fashion. Kids, like to show and get bullied because of fashion. You don't have the latest fashions.
Sure.
You just don't you minimize those types of things in a classical school, because the idea is you want to build you want cohesion,
Right.
and you don't want kids fighting over things and getting in, and bullying each other over things that are just extraneous. So what you're
Right.
trying to do is to get kids to be thoughtful about one another and to think about how do we be cohesive as a group and as a team, and that we're in this together, working and learning learning together, and in what's very rigorous pedagogy.
Right.
So those are the things that are sort of the distinctives of a classical school that you will not get in public schools. And that's why we think that the classical model is a model that all public schools should adopt. And what we hope is all Christians, or people who believe in education, who believe in, reading, writing, and arithmetic that was taught 50, 60, 70, 100 years ago,
Yeah.
or 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, that this is the model that we should move forward. And I would say start charter schools. I mean, they are hard. They're hard. Trust me, they're hard, and there's a lot of barriers. But if there parents or people out there who have the desire and the funds, start a charter school. Work with Hillsdale. I mean, because they give you a lot of support at Hillsdale. Contribute to charter schools such as OCCA. We're a 501c3, so you can contribute to our foundation and help us to grow and eventually get a permanent facility, which we're seeking now. We're in K through 8 now, and we want to go K through 12, but we're starting a capital campaign to get a building so we can go full on K through 12. So I think there's also school boards. People out there, if you really are interested, yeah. So what would really be great is for people to get on school boards. If you are a parent or a concerned citizen, run for your school board, or go to the school board meetings, get involved. This, to me, classical schools are a movement. This is a movement, and we need people who really care about our children, who care about the next generation, to get involved. So get on school board, get on a school board, whether it be at the local district level or it be at the county level. We need more people who are supporters of charter schools and classical schools to get involved, particularly if you're parents and you're tired of seeing what's going on. And I think what happened during COVID, as bad as COVID was, it was horrible what happened with COVID. But what COVID did is expose to parents what their kids were learning, and they decided they did not like what they were seeing in the public schools.
Yeah, well, God's going to use God's going to use crises to reveal.
God used this crisis in a huge way.
Yeah.
And so, if parents want to see change, change is not going to happen by itself. We need to have parents and other concerned citizens to get out there.
I mean, are you seeing what other? I mean, I know we're seeing. What other kind of groups are out there that maybe you are locking arms with in this? I mean, do you have? I mean, other than maybe just Christian communities, but is there some movement in other communities that is also they're also waking up and saying, hey, we want good old-fashioned American sort of education back?
No, there's no other movement that we're seeing. But what we are seeing is that parents who are in, say, since we're a county charter, that means students can be from anywhere in Orange County. What we're seeing is parents that have kids even in some of the best public schools here. For example, Beckman High School, Northwood, Tustin, Pioneer. There's some great schools here in Tustin, Irvine area, and very good schools, let's say, in Tustin and Irvine. But the thing is, still, parents are saying, you know, I don't. Even though we have some of the better school, we have some of the best schools.
Mhm.
They don't like the values that they're teaching in the schools. They don't like the values that are coming out of it. So
Right.
they're seeking a classical education, even though their kids are in good schools. And but they go for a reason, not that the education is not a good education, but they go for the reason that it's really about the values.
Right.
And
Because
also,
if you get into the
yeah,
deeper,
yeah,
deeper pedagogy of the human
exactly,
soul,
exactly.
which the
And
other
that's what they're
schools are
getting
not.
in the classical school.
Yeah. Well, look, this has been great. I want to just one final question. You've kind of touched on this, but for the sake of those who are going to see this podcast, with respect to the OCCA specifically, right? The Orange County Classical Academy, how can people get involved? How can they help very concretely?
Okay, well, they can go to orangecountyclassicalacademy.org. That'll tell you all about us, our values, our affiliation with Hillsdale, how you can contribute. We would love to have people contribute to OCCA because we really would love to have our own building within the next couple of years, and we would be so appreciative. And also, if you're interested, if you want to, have a tour, you want to come and see what the school is about, we do give tours for people who are interested or just want to learn more about classical education. So orangecountyclassicalacademy.org, and we would love to have a conversation with you. So and Tony, thank you so much for having me. I really have loved having this conversation with you.
Well, this is great, and I want to have more of them, and I want to see more. See more good work out of you, and I just want to see the OCCA thrive in multiple locations. And I really hope that this podcast and others that we'll do will invigorate people, really energize people, because like I said, I feel like we have a lot of good thoughts, we have a lot of good ideas, we got a lot of resources that are sort of hovering at the theoretical level about how to fight this cultural battle, how to fight this battle of the worldviews that are really vying, for our civilization. These are civilizational level things. But at some point we got to put the meat on the bone and get the boots on the ground. And the only way to do that is to start schools.
This is the practical way to do it.
Educate K through 12 in the classroom 5 or 6 days a week, maybe 6th day, maybe we go back to school on Saturdays. I don't know. But and teachers in the classroom teaching the right content to attentive and disciplined students.
You got it.
Yeah. It's the simplest form. It's hard to do.
It's hard to do, but it's hard to do. Yeah. But it's well worth it. It's hard to do, but it is well worth the effort. And there are people out there, and we would love to open another 10 classical academies. Yeah. So if we get enough support, we can hopefully do that.
All right. Well, Walter, thanks so much for doing this with us at the Kirkwood Center, and we look to more cooperation together in the future.
Great. Thank you, Tony. I hope we'll talk soon.
God bless.